So let me introduce, you may guess who is the man close to Josh Bongard. I know something about Josh, the other guy, I don't know. Professor Bongard is at the University of Vermont. He's the co-author of our textbook, How the Body Shapes the Way We Think. That is a very stressed and repeated concept also today. And actually, he was had the opportunity to meet Obama because actually he received the very prestigious prize in the U.S., which is the Presidential Early Career Award, and in 2011. He's still young, so. But, okay, so he will talk about one topic that you will see is extremely central to the kind of view of intelligence that we are discussing here, which is how morphological complexity evolves. So I leave the floor to Josh.
Okay, thank you very much, Fabio, and thanks also to Rolf and Nathan and the rest of the Shanghai lecture organizers. I'm speaking to you this morning from the University of Vermont, which is on the east coast of the United States. So it's now 4:30 in the morning, so if I'm a little incoherent from time to time, please excuse me. And I also apologize for missing my previous speaking engagement back in October. There was a confusion on my part about time zones, but I'm here now, and thanks for your interest and attention. So as Fabio mentioned, I work in the area of evolutionary robotics, and what I thought I would do today is to give you a taste of some of the research projects that my group has worked on. And I'm going to focus specifically on some of our evolutionary robotics experiments where we're evolving or optimizing not just the control policy or the brain of the robot, but the morphology as well. And I'll show you in particular some projects where over phylogenetic time, as Fabio was just mentioning, we evolve the body plans of robots, and those body plans or morphologies become more complex over time. So using these evolutionary techniques, it allows us to explore some of the connections between the evolution of brain and body, development or change over the lifetime of an individual robot, and in some cases learning on top of that. So this gives us an opportunity to integrate the three timescales that Rolf and I talk about in our book, How the Body Shapes the Way We Think. So before I introduce you to this idea of evolutionary robotics, I thought I would just take a step back and talk about robotics as a whole. Most of you have probably seen this robot before. This is the Big Dog robot. Are you playing video 2A, Nathan, for me? Okay. So obviously a very sophisticated machine. This is developed by Boston Dynamics here in the United States. As you can see, very robust to quadrupedal locomotion. So this is a current state-of-the-art in robotics. So we won't play the whole video. If you could pause the video, Nathan, and we'll move on. This is another product from Boston Dynamics. This is the Cheetah robot that's currently in development. This is an attempt to develop a robot that's capable of very fast locomotion. There's a lot of innovations in terms of the body plan of the robot that you can see here. So another example of state-of-the-art. Let's pause this video and move on. This is a third project. This is Professor D'Andrea's quadcopters developed at ETH in Zurich. What you're watching here is Professor D'Andrea controlling the robot with a wireless remote control. Very sophisticated control engineering, feedback engineering. Here you can see Raf playing catch with his quadcopter. A very sophisticated autonomous robot. Again, let's pause this video and move on. This is a project from just this year. This is a fourth robot that I wanted to show. This is the 3D biped. which you can see is capable of forward flips. Does anybody want to take a guess about when this particular robot was developed? Does anybody know? This was a robot developed at MIT. Okay, let's move on. So this was a robot that was actually developed back in 1992. So 21 years ago, this robot was developed. And I tend to show these videos together to try and make the point that in some respects, we've come a long way in robotics, but in other respects, we've seen somewhat limited progress. So if we can move on, Nathan, to slide number 6. So we made limited progress, and the question is why is that the case? And in a lot of robotics projects, outside evolutionary robotics and developmental robotics, the roboticist will choose the body plan of the robot first, and then try and develop a control policy or a brain for a robot. But as you've heard throughout the Shanghai lectures, we need to think carefully about the body of the robot to allow it to explore and learn about its environment and build on those experiences. So looking at the history of robotics, we see that robotics has been very successful in terms of manufacturing. We have industrial robots that are non-autonomous, that are programmed to do the same thing over and over again. But the big challenge has turned out to be historically adaptive robots. Why can we not create robots that continuously adapt their mode of operation to deal with changes in light levels or in unstructured environments like construction sites and so on? So in the last 21 years or so, we've been able to now create Big Dog that can recover if it slips on the ice, or these quadcopters. But where are these intelligent and adaptive robots? In evolutionary robotics, we take a lot of inspiration from biology in general, but descent with modification or natural selection or evolution in particular. So Mother Nature has been able to produce billions and billions of biological machines that are both adaptive and in some cases exhibit what we might refer to as intelligent behavior. So rather than trying to program the robot directly or build a robot and optimize just the brain of the robot, we use evolution to shape or to sculpt the entire robot, body and brain together. So I'll just show you a snapshot of how this works. So Nathan, if you can play video 8A. What you're watching in this video, which is quite an old video now, this was taken while I was still in Rolf's lab back in Zurich. You're watching 16 robots, and these are obviously robots operating in simulation. These robots are operating in a physics engine, so although it's virtual and a simulation, these robots are still embodied. They have mass, they have momentum, they have friction, and they're exploiting their interaction with the environment, in this case to exhibit locomotion. You're watching a population of 16 robots. All 16 of these robots have very similar control policies or brains, but there are slight differences in these artificial brains, so that now you can start to see there's differences in behavior. You'll notice that some of the robots have run into each other, but there are two robots at the top of the screen and also off to the left of the screen that continue to walk. So the computer is observing all 16 of these robots. And in this particular example, the computer will now delete all of the robots that ran into one another or stopped moving or fell over, and it will take the robots that were still moving and it will make copies of them, and then it will introduce slight random changes to their neural networks so that now these new child robots will behave slightly different from their parents, and the computer will iterate or loop over this process generation over generation, and we usually leave these simulations running on a supercomputer, and assuming that the supercomputer evolves a robot for us that's sufficiently interesting or sufficiently sophisticated, we might go to the extra effort of trying to manufacture or build a physical version of this robot like you see in video 8B. So this is a robot that has the same body plan, and it's a robot that's taken from a different research project, but you get the basic idea. So we evolve populations of robots in simulation, and then take one of these robots and try and create a version of it in reality. Now, often it's very difficult to get the physical robot to exhibit the behaviors that we saw in simulation, and this is known as the reality gap problem. So how do we preserve evolved behavior from simulation into reality? And that's a current state-of-the-art challenge that us and other research labs are working on. So moving on, this is a list of all of the things that are typically modeled in an evolutionary robotics experiment, but also a very long list of things that are not modeled. So the most important thing, obviously, is to get the basic ingredients of biological evolution, which is that we have a population of robots, not just a single robot. There is genetic variation in these robots, so there is some underlying data structure that describes the body and the brain of the robot, and that underlying genetic variation gives rise to variation in behavior, and that behavior affects the fitness, which ultimately determines which robots are deleted and which robots we then make modified copies, which ones we mutate, which ones we sexually recombine, and so on. Although we're doing this in simulation, it's important that these robots are still embodied. So even though they're virtual because they have mass, they have a physical impact on their environment or an impact on other robots, as you saw in the video. And also the environment has a physical impact on the robot. So these machines are embodied in the sense that they push against the world and they observe how the world pushes back. And evolution evolves the body and brains of these robots to exploit that interaction. We usually have a relatively simple abstraction of biological evolution. Most of the time, we're usually just mutating just parts of the robot's neural network. So we're changing the synaptic strength or the amount of influence of one neuron in the robot's brain on another neuron in the robot's brain. And then again, I've included a long list of all of the things that we don't model. So as Fabio mentioned, we're creating abstractions here. We're not trying to simulate all of the details of evolution or all of the details of the development of a single robot. We need to abstract away some of the details. So usually we start with this basic recipe here. Okay, so just to give you a little bit more of an idea of the details of this, what you see in this slide here, this is a representation or a simplified figure of an artificial neural network. So in each one of the robots in our population, we have a collection of sensor neurons that are drawing information from the world. The values of those sensors propagate down to interneurons, and then further down to the motor neurons, and then the motor neurons dictate how the robot moves. And we simulate this robot over a number of time steps in the simulation. And then we finally assign, or the computer assigns, a number to that robot. How good did that robot do at whatever the task is we want the robot to do? So if it's a locomotion task, in this example, maybe a robot with this particular neural network traveled 2.3 meters. Remember that when we're working with evolution, we always have a population of these robots. So we take each one of these neural networks, we drop it into the robot and evaluate fitness. Perhaps another neural network in the population enables the robot to travel 2.8 meters, so slightly further forward. So we delete the first network, and we produce children from the more successful network. And the red arrows show you the points of mutation. So this is where the neural network is being randomly changed by the computer. And after we make these mutations, we reevaluate these new neural networks. And some of them, like network N2 here, maybe doesn't travel as far. But this new neural network, N1, travels very far and also travels further than the parent. So now this particular network will outcompete the parent, and we continue, and now we introduce some new mutations to the new children, and we continue generation after generation. So that's the basic idea of evolutionary robotics. That's usually our starting point. Okay, so here's another 3 videos just to give you a feel for how this works. Nathan, if you can start video 15A. Now we're going to evolve not just for locomotion, but for object manipulation. So Fabio was talking about object manipulation and robot arms. What you're watching in this video is the first generation where we have random neural networks for the robot. And as you can see, the robot is not doing a very good job. So now, Nathan, if you can play video 15B. This is an hour into the evolutionary process. And you can see now that the robot arm is starting to manipulate the object, but is still not doing a great job. And if you play 15C, this has taken 8 hours into the evolutionary run. The robot has now evolved the ability to grasp objects and lift the objects. And I use these videos to show something else, which is we can see here the beginnings of what we might call cognitive or intelligent behavior. So if you play that video one more time, Nathan, if you watch carefully, you'll notice that the robot lifts the round objects to the left, and it's lifting the edged or the cube object to the right. So although this robot has no language, it's signaling to us that it's evolved the ability to categorize. It can distinguish between round and edged objects, because when we did this experiment originally, we built into the fitness function a reward for grasping objects, for lifting objects, and for lifting round objects to the left and edged objects to the right. If we now analyze that evolved neural network, we're acting like biologists. It's very difficult for us to go in and understand how this evolved neural network works. But what's exciting is that if you look inside, there is no local representation for round objects in this part of the neural network and a representation for edged objects in this other part of the neural network. So Fabio mentioned the symbol grounding problem, right? So here, our evolved robots never experienced the symbol grounding problem because they never had to ground pre-existing symbols. The ability to categorize emerges out of the robot's interaction with these objects. Okay. So again, coming back to this list of our basic evolutionary robotics experiment, where we start usually by just evolving parts of the brain of a robot and then not modeling lots of other details about evolution, we can now add in additional details to our experiment to explore different aspects of embodied cognition. So in the next project that I'm going to show you, we take evolution and we allow it now not just to evolve the brain of the robot, but we're going to expand the evolutionary algorithm so that evolution can change both the body and the brain of the robot. This is a particular approach to robotics that I started working on when I was a PhD in Rolf Pfeiffer's lab. I continued working on with Hod at Cornell, and this is the most common approach that we use now in my research lab here at UVM. So I'm going to show you now 2 videos that are taken from a very recent paper. This is now actually in the process of publication. So if you could, Nathan, if you could play video 18A. You're going to see a robot here that was evolved for locomotion over flat ground. And if you want a robot that all it needs to do is move over flat ground, perhaps not surprisingly, you get a robot with a relatively simple body plan. So one of the nice things about evolution is that it doesn't necessarily complicate things unless it needs something that's complicated. So an interesting byproduct of evolutionary robotics is it can often give us an understanding of the lower bound on robotics. So what is the simplest robot that can perform the behavior we're interested in a given environment? In this second video now, 18b, you're going to see exactly the same evolutionary robotics experiment. Everything is the same, except now we evolved this robot in a different environment. You can think about this as a different world or an ice world. So the long blue bars that you see in this video, these are zero friction objects. So you can think of them as blocks of ice. But as you can see in the video, there's small cracks between the ice. And the robot, in this case, has evolved a more complex body plan that allows it to reach down into the cracks and somehow pull or push itself forward. So we're starting to see the evolution of morphological complexity, not because we explicitly wanted a robot that was complex, but was because this complex morphology, or more complex morphology, was required for this particular environment. So this is sort of a starting point now for scaling up to more complex environments, or more challenging environments, and more challenging behaviors. And as evolution proceeds, we can observe, does the body plan become more complex? Does the brain of the robot become more complex? Or does both the brain and the body of the robot become more complex together? So we can explore now the trade-off between body and brain, and this is something that we explored again in the book, which is often if we have the right kind of body, we can get away with a relatively simple brain, or vice versa. So we can observe how evolution strikes this balance. Does it increase complexity of body plan, or increase complexity of neural network, or increase the complexity of both? Okay, so again, going back now to the standard evolutionary robotics paradigm where we're just evolving the brain of the robot, let's add in another detail and explore another aspect of embodied cognition. So in this case, we're adding in the evolution of development, and we just heard a very nice overview of development from Fabio. And we're going to look explicitly at the interaction between change at different time scales. So change over evolutionary time, and then change over the lifetime of an individual robot. So this was some work we reported on a couple of years ago, which we kind of jokingly referred to as Robo, Evo, Devo. So the evolution of development in biology is known as Evo, Devo. So obviously a developmental plan, or the way that a human develops from an infant into an adult, that trajectory or that change is being genetically determined. So evolution is encoding and changing that developmental trajectory. So Fabio was talking about evolution and learning. So imagine, development and learning. So imagine now a graph where we have evolution on one axis and development on the other. We can look at the interaction between these two time scales. So I'm going to show you a series of videos now, and the first set of videos are taken from our control experiment, in which we have no development. And then in the second series of videos, I'm going to show you where we add in development. So Nathan, if you can play slide 21A. Like before, we're going to see the initial random controllers. So here we're evolving for locomotion. So the robot needs to travel towards that target object that's front and left of the robot. We're dealing with a quadrupedal or four-legged robot here. And as you can see, it's not doing a very good job at locomotion. Okay, if you can now play video 18B. This is after about an hour, we start to get some form of locomotion. It's not the most efficient quadrupedal gait you've ever seen, but at least it gets the robot to the target object. And again, this takes about an hour. And then in this case, we transferred it to a very simple physical robot. So if you can play 21C. We just use Lego Mindstorms in this case to build a simple physical version of this robot that exhibits a gait that's similar to the one that evolved. Okay, that's fine. Again here we're using evolution to evolve the body plan of the robot. And now we're going to add in development. So we're going to go back to the beginning of evolution and start with random controllers. And we're going to evolve robots now that exhibit change over their lifetime. So now they're going to start as an infant robot or a child robot in which they have no legs. And as the robot behaves over its 5-second lifetime, its body plan is going to change, and specifically, it's going to grow legs. So Nathan, if you can play video 21E, you'll see actually the evolved behavior, which is that the robot starts without legs, and as it's walking, its morphology is changing. So now we're seeing this developmental trajectory. You wouldn't mind playing it again? We can see it starts in this legless form, and it gradually grows into this legged form. And it turns out that it took only a few minutes to evolve this behavior compared to the hour it took to evolve the robot in which there was no development, in which the robot started upright with 4 legs and maintained that over its lifetime. And the reason why we could evolve a gait for this robot in a few minutes rather than an hour is because we have a more dynamically stable robot. Obviously, if you have no legs, you're lying flat on the ground, and you don't have to deal with the balance problem. So optimization can proceed much more quickly and develop a gait for this robot that works, and it just needs to maintain its balance in the last few time steps of its lifetime, which is easier. But we eventually want to have a gait or a behavior for this upright legged robot. So now we continue evolution, but we're going to change the developmental trajectory. Now the robots in this next phase of evolution are going to be like their ancestors, but they're going to start with short legs. So if you can play video 21F now, Nathan. This is 21F, thank you. It's a little difficult to see, but this robot actually starts with some legs, and it exhibits a gait that's quite similar to its ancestors. So now we're going to pause evolution, and if you play video 21G, now the robots start. Now they start, or they get to the upright legged form even faster. So the developmental program is changing now. They have to get to the adult form faster, and they need to keep moving in this upright adult form. So now in this is phase number 3. So now we're going to pause phase number 3, and I'm going to play the 4th and final phase for you, in which we discard or throw away the infant form altogether. So now these robots, when they're born in the upright legged form, and they have to maintain that legged form throughout their lifetime. So now we have a behavior for this upright 4-legged robot that we can download into the physical robot. And it turns out, which we found in these experiments, we can actually evolve these gaits faster when we include development, and these particular behaviors are more robust compared to the case where we don't use any development at all. So we're demonstrating that there's an engineering advantage to using development. So obviously we need to justify why we're building in this additional biological complexity, and it turns out that it allows us to evolve robust behaviors for our robots more rapidly. So I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just skip. I'm going to skip these next few slides. And I wanted to end by introducing, I'll just stop here for a moment. This is some work that Hod Lipson and Victor Zykov and I did a few years ago, dealing with the reality gap problem. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, it's often challenging to transfer our evolved controllers or our evolved robots from simulation to reality. This was one attempt to try and do so. There's the reference if you'd like to read more about that particular work. So I'd like to end now by introducing you to a platform that we've developed, which we call Ludobots. So Ludo is Latin for play. I've given you the URL there. If you go to that particular URL, you can download Ludobots and you can try out some of these experiments yourself. So just to show you how this works, Nathan, if you can play video 27A. This is some work with some high school students here in the United States. So one high school student was interested in creating a robot that would exhibit very fast legged locomotion. So now if you could play video 27B. This student took that animal as inspiration and now built a robot that doesn't look anything like a cheetah. They basically built a version of the robot that I just showed you. But what you're watching them doing is creating an environment for this robot in the simulation. And now that they've finished building, they turn on the evolutionary process, and the computer is now trying to find a behavior for the robot that this student made. If you can now play video 27C. So this was another high school student that was interested in amphibians and frogs and other animals that are capable of jumping or ballistic motion. And this student, if you can play video 27D, this student built, again, another, basically the same robot, but as you'll see in a moment, this student built a different environment for the robot. This student is building a set of stairs between the robot and the target object. So now the fitness of this robot is its ability to climb the stairs and get to the target object. And the robot's just starting to evolve the ability to jump from one step to the next. Okay, if you can play video 27E. So this third high school student was interested in brachiation. So this is a gibbon exhibiting brachiation, or the ability to swing from limb to limb. And now if you could play video 27F. This student, again, built a robot that doesn't look anything like a gibbon or a primate, and we were a little confused about what this student was doing, but you'll see in a moment. The student was now building a series of metal bars between the robot and the target object, and now evolution evolves this behavior. So again, by changing the body of the robot and by changing the environment in which the robots evolve, you can evolve robots to exhibit different behaviors without having to write additional computer code and so on. So if you're interested in these evolutionary robotics techniques, you can try out Ludobots to get started. Okay. I think I'll stop there, and I'd just like to acknowledge some of the work of my students. Josh Auerbach, who's now a postdoc at EPFL in Switzerland, did the work on the robots evolving in icy terrains. Shane Sealis and Gordon Dragoon helped me develop Ludobots, and I showed you some work I did previously with Hod Lipson and Victor Zykov, and I'd like to thank some of the local support here in Vermont and my funding sources, the National Science Foundation, and DARPA. So thanks very much, and if I have time, I'm happy to answer a few questions.
Okay, I think this is time for questions. So I hope I think it's stimulating. Actually, it points to the center with practical examples. Practical simulation examples point directly to the kind of topic that we were talking about today. No? This relation between evolution and development. So, and it's also an example of synthetic modeling, meaning that if you want to understand the relation, for example, between evolution and development, or phylogenesis or ontogenesis, you have a way to do it. You simplify abstract and you try to build models. I don't know if you have questions.
I think there's a question there.
Well, very well.
Yeah.
We have a question in Berlin.
Hi. I wanted to know if there are experiments not only in evolution of one population, but on coevolution of two different populations.
Yeah, so the question is, are there experiments dealing with coevolution, where you have two or more populations and evolutionary changes in one population exerts pressure on the other? There are some abstract studies in this area, but not too many studies with actual robots. There is one exception to that. There's some work by Carl Sims, S-I-M-S. Carl Sims did some of the original work back in the early 90s on evolving robot bodies and brains. And in his publication from, I think, 1994, he actually exhibited coevolution, where you had two robots that were from two different populations, and they were competing over a common resource. So they had to grab an object that was midway between the two of them. And it was a very nice set of experiments, because you could see when one strategy evolved in one population. So you might see one robot trying to hook around the object and pull it towards itself. The other population would now evolve a counteracting strategy, such as falling and holding the object so that the other robot could not pull it. So it was a great example, and he actually looked at different ways that you could pit these two populations against one another to get this ratcheting effect where evolutionary improvements in one population challenge the other population to evolve more sophisticated or more capable behaviors. It's a good question. Thank you.
Another question?
Okay.
Is there a microphone?
Yeah.
It's on. Okay. In the evolution of the morphological evolution, what kind of cell did you use, or minimal unit, when you get it? What I mean?
Yes, I understand. So I didn't show you any of the cell-based work here, but I think Fabio showed a few pictures in his talk. So when I was doing my PhD work, we were developing the morphologies of these robots, where they were made up of these simple building blocks or these simple spheres, and we had small pieces of neural network inside each of these spheres. And inside each of these spheres was a copy of the genome for that robot. So in essence, inside each cell, you had a simple dynamical system where you had the genome, where the connections between the genes were turning each other on and off. And when a gene is turned on, it can affect the local phenotype or the local structure of the robot. And some of those local changes could be to increase the size of that cell to the point where it would split into two and they would connect together in a particular way. There were also local changes like creating a new sensor neuron, or splitting two neurons in two, or growing the synapse from one neuron into a neighboring cell. So in essence, you had the genome that was triggering local changes in each one of these cells. Does that answer your question?
Yes, great, thank you.
Cool. Okay, you're welcome. Any other questions?
Okay.
No? Okay.
No other questions. So I want to say two things. One is that if you have questions that you don't dare to raise in public, you can contact us through the question board or any other way, and we will forward it to the speaker, in particular to Josh. Another thing is that as regards the Ludobots, people involved in koans, actually we have granted to all people registering for the projects a 6 months license of Webbots, but this doesn't mean that you are forced to use Webbots. You can also use, it's a valid tool, is Ludobots. So
great. Thank you.
This could be, so it's because for some kind of coins it could also be a good choice. There could be some good reason also to use Ludobots. So
that's great.
Thank you also for quoting it, John.
Okay.
Okay. And there is a question. Okay, a question from someone, one of the people following us on the streaming. So.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask the question for Francesco, which is from Pisa. He has a question. In evolutionary robotics, do we have tools to interpret the evolved brain? For example, tools for understanding the consequences of a certain morphology on the neural circuitry?
Aha, that's a good question. So I understood the question to be about analysis, which is how do we analyze the evolved neural network, or how do we analyze the impact of the body on the neural network. So one analysis tool we often use is, as I just showed you, is we perform a control experiment, a control treatment and an experimental treatment. And in the control treatment, we only evolve the brain. And in the experimental treatment, we evolve both the body and the brain. But we evolve both in the same environment for the same task. So if we're evolving the body and not evolving the body, we then look at the evolved neural networks. And if the evolved neural networks are simpler, then in the case where we evolve the body, we treat that as evidence that evolution is striking or is finding this trade-off between body and brain. So if we give evolution the opportunity to change the body, often evolution will produce a simpler or a smaller neural network compared to the case where we only allowed evolution to evolve the brain but not the body. So that's a common tool that we use in evolutionary robotics. All right, thank you for your question.
So if we don't have other questions, I think we can thank Josh for giving this very interesting talk in the middle of East Coast night. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.